different parts of the world. I have to say this is the second time we're running this webinar, and we're really encouraged by the huge interest from operations. We've had throughout the day over 500 staff registering from about 50 countries, really from North America, Africa, Middle East, Asia, which shows this becoming our most popular webinar so far, and really the interest you have about the use of power that we have as humanitarians, and the need to be able to use it in a responsible way, where in our response we put the affected people at the center of the response and at the heart of what we're trying to do. I'd like to start with just providing a couple of words on the webinar guidelines, and so that you can actively participate. If you look at your screen on the right-hand side, there is a chat panel, a chat box. We would really like to encourage all of you participating to have a very informal chat with each other. You can actually select one member, or you can share with everybody your experience, your best practice, how you found applying accountability to affected people in your own context. Further down to the right, there is a questions panel, and I'd really like to encourage all of you to send us questions, which I will be taking and passing on to our speakers. Please, we want to make sure that this is an interactive discussion, so we want to encourage you to make use of both the chat box and the questions channel. We have also prepared a number of background documents, which I'd like really to highlight. You see in front of you on the screen, there is actually 9 documents that are all specially prepared for this webinar, which gives you the experience of the different colleagues and good practices on different parts of the world of what they have gone about applying. I hope you make use of these reference documents and you find it useful. In today's webinar, we're going to go for about 90 minutes or so, and actually during the first 45 minutes or so, I'm going to be asking a couple of questions or two to each of our 5 panelists that I will introduce in a minute. And in the second half, we're going to take questions that come directly from you. Actually, I would like to encourage you to send questions as early as possible, and I'll try to incorporate them in the webinar discussion. It's really, we want to make sure that we answer your questions, and we provide as much as practical, hands-on, field-oriented advice, suggestions to all of you. The objective of today's discussion is really to bring a lot more into the center of the humanitarian operations, the accountability to affected people, and most importantly, to provide operations with the practical guidance and the steps in order to take the AAP and put it in practice in a more proactive way in the field operations. So I'd like really now to move to the presentation of the speakers, and I'm delighted to first introduce Jasmine Whitbread, who is the CEO of Save the Children International. Jasmine is also the champion for the Interagency Standing Committee's principles. Jasmine has been with Save the Children since 2005, since 2010 in her role as the CEO for the Save the Children Fund International. She has also worked with Oxfam beforehand, and she comes from the private sector. Our second speaker and guest is Toby Lanzer. Toby is the Secretary General's Deputy Special Representative in South Sudan, part of the UNMISS mission. He's also the Humanitarian Coordinator. Toby has been for a number of years in several field operations, including in Timor, in Darfur, in Central African Republic, and comes with an extensive experience in both humanitarian and development fields. Our third speaker is Nicolas Serres. Nicolas works with Transparency International. He's the Global Advisor on Accountability and Aid Integrity. Nicolas is joining us from Nairobi, where he would be sharing the Kenya model of the accountability to affected people. And Nicolas has worked for a number of years, primarily in Africa and the Middle East, in operations related to humanitarian and development programs. Our next speaker is Sutapa Holader, who is the Accountability to Affected People Advisor in the Philippines. Actually, she had this role during her assignment in the Philippines last year. She's joining us actually for this call, for this webinar from Australia. And it's actually in the middle of the night in Australia now, and she will be sharing with us her experience from the Philippines. Sutapa comes with an experience from public health, but also having worked in particular on accountability to affected people in a number of operations, and more recently in West Africa related to the Ebola response. And our last speaker, who is actually with me here in Geneva, is Prita Low. Prita is the co-chair of the Interagency Standing Committee Task Team on Accountability to Affected Persons and on Prevention of Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, the PSEA. She's also the Deputy Director at UNHCR, the Division of International Protection. And Prita comes also with a wealth of experience, having worked in Asia, in Africa, in the Balkans, both in terms of protection, but also in community-based programs. So a warm welcome to all our speakers and panelists, and who will be really sharing with all of us, with all of you, their wisdom and, most importantly, practical guidance in terms of how to go applying the AAP at the field operations. I'd actually like to start the first question with Jasmine, who's joining us from London. Jasmine, could I ask you to unpack for us the principles related to the accountability to affected people? What are the 5 commitments? Could you elaborate a little bit further for us, please? Over to you.
Sure, thanks very much, panelists. And I think there's yeah, you've got a slide that's got the facts. That's excellent. Thank you very much, so people can follow along. So, you know, when I started at Oxfam, you know, 15 years or so ago, accountability to affected populations was still, you know, had a smaller following than it does today. I think if we'd had a webinar then, even if it had been possible, it would have only had a handful of people on it. And it was really seen as something, you know, very difficult to do, changing power dynamics. You know, how on earth could you make yourself, as a humanitarian actor, for example, in the middle of the war in Sierra Leone, as I was then, more accountable to people, you know, fleeing violence. Very tricky question that was faced, that I was having to consider. I think things have moved on a lot. I think NGOs have been grappling with this question perhaps for the longest time. I think by the time I got onto the, as the chair of the steering committee and sat on the Interagency Standing Committee, you know, a fair amount of progress had been made, particularly, as I say, in Oxfam, and then in Safer Children, I know, in my fellow SCHR agency, NGO organisations. And this had begun to be a conversation at the UN principles level as well. And I think, you know, it was very encouraging to me. I think it was in 2001 that we agreed these 5 principles. And I think the first one is very important. And really, if we only had that first one, that's the most important at the level of the principles of the heads of agencies of all the big UN agencies. And this basically says that each of us, as head of an agency, will demonstrate our commitment by not by making lots of speeches and not by saying that yes, we're all in agreement with it, but actually you know, showing how this has been incorporated into the sort of core way in which we run our agencies, all the way from the design of programs, proposal writing, through to the recruitment and training of staff, through performance management. In other words, there'd be, you know, rewards and sanctions for doing this well or badly, working with partners, monitoring, evaluation, and really sort of ensuring that this is highlighted in reporting. And then the other principles, the 2, 3, 4, and 5 underneath, you can see, really sort of pull out some of those elements in more detail that typically, you know, could be not so well understood. Transparency you know, really being clear, being prepared to push agencies' principles are in terms of how, you know, the above point in terms of how you're meant to be working, to give information, to put information in the hands of the affected population so that they can make some judgments. And then, you know, hopefully they'll be happy with what they see is available to them. But if they have feedback, and particularly complaints or concerns, that there is a mechanism for registering those, and that's point number 3. Participation, I think this is perhaps the best known and the best understood principle, I think that, you know, this is something that has been obviously NGOs for decades and UN agencies now to different degrees have become very good at sort of actually enabling people to participate, but that isn't the same as accountability on its own. It's an element. And I already mentioned the last principle as an element of the overall commitments that the heads of agencies have to be able to demonstrate that this is included in the design and monitoring and evaluation of programs. So that, as I say, was very encouraging and an important step that everybody really did sign up to these. There was nobody saying, no, we don't agree with that, so that was important. But then last year, we felt that having asked for a report back on a number of occasions and not really getting anywhere, Valerie and I wrote a frank letter to each of the agency heads saying, look, we really don't think we're moving ahead as well as we could be on these commitments that we made, and can we please ask, although there's some, you know, good practice, and we'd like to hear more about those examples, we would like a report back. And there has been a patchy report back. I mean, a number of agencies did write quite long reports, some didn't write reports. And, you know, this is really OCHA's job. I'd like to see OCHA feeling a bit more empowered to do this a bit more robustly, actually keep, you know, feet to the fire in terms of, you know, we all agree to do this, so are we doing it, and reporting back on that. So that's still a work in progress. So, you know, that's probably enough for the time being. Happy to move on to another area of questioning.
Thanks, Jasmine. Indeed, your role as a champion and then the role of the principal is really vital. You talked about the feedback you got, which was really patchy because the protocol and the 5 commitments have very clear expectations at all levels, from the leadership, from the agency leadership, at the field leadership. The feedback, the participation, the design, the monitoring, it's all there. So really, it's about putting in practice the application. So I'd like to ask you, at the field level, I mean, what changes would you like to see happening more, perhaps in terms of leadership of the Humanitarian Coordinator or of the agents on the ground, in order to make sure that a greater respect is put and that the affected people are really in the center of the response? So what would you like to see more at the field level? Over to you.
Well, obviously, within each of the agencies, I'd like to see this driven down as a core central part of how, you know, performance is managed. So from the head of the agency down to, you know, through the hierarchy, right to the front line. So, you know, if I take my own agency as an example, you know, I was in South Sudan I think about nearly a year ago, wasn't it, Toby? If Toby's on the line. And I was horrified to find that some of the distributions that we were doing, there was absolutely no, you know, signage up. It was not clear to the affected populations what they could anticipate to receive, who was being chosen, you know, if they had a complaint, where to go. And unfortunately, you know, I still find cases like that across my organisation. The norm is now becoming that we do have those accountability mechanisms in place, but I still find cases where it's not so. And I would expect line management, it shouldn't require a visit from me to go and sort of insist on it. Line management should be asking for that to be in place, and there should be some accountability around that. And I would expect each agency to be taking that approach. But specifically, because I know we have got Toby and hopefully other humanitarian coordinators on the call, an important area that I think Preeta and others that are following up on this discovered, so I'll be interested once we come to them, is that, you know, when this was then communicated out from the principal level, from the interagency standing committee, I don't know, something got lost in translation because a number of humanitarian coordinators, not the best of them, but some of them came back saying, well, we're not sure about this, we're not sure we completely agree with these 5 principles, and, we think maybe they're, optional. We don't see how we need to take them on board on a sort of cross-agency and coordinating perspective. And that was disappointing, and I think we've had another go at communicating that through, and hopefully we will get that message through. It's not up there for debate. What I would like to see humanitarian coordinators do, and I think the best do this, is start with those principles. That should be in the first coordination meeting, they're up on the wall, and everybody gets a handout, and that would help drive the agenda of discussion of the whole coordination enterprise, really, at a country level and at a sub regional level as well.
Thanks, Jasmine. Actually, we will be hearing in a few minutes from Toby on the South Sudan experience, but also from other colleagues on how they have gone about applying it. And I just want to reconfirm, we have a number of humanitarian coordinators and also teams that work with the humanitarian coordinators who are online listening to this conversation. So I think on the field, what we hear is that there is no question on embracing the issue. It's kind of more about practically how to go about applying it from a collective perspective. And Jasmine, we just have a question that came in from the field. Actually, it was sent to us. And it's a little bit of a provocative question, saying, how do you rate your peers in the interagency in terms of their commitment to the principles and participation in the AAP? Is everybody doing everything possible? Are there some who do more than others? Surely a lot should be done at the field, but also the message has to come maybe in a more consistent way from a top-down way. And is there something that you, in your capacity as a champion, could continue more with your peers' principles to make sure that we all work towards the same way to make sure that the message also goes from top down as well as reinforcing it?
Sorry, yeah. I was going to say, I think that's a very fair challenge, Panos, and I think it's both. I mean, the worst thing that we could do is be pointing fingers up and down the organisations, and say, oh no, it's because the people at the top aren't committed, oh no, it's because the people at the bottom aren't. I mean, I think actually there's a lot of goodwill here, but there are, we're working in an incredibly challenging humanitarian system that, you question whether it's even a system, not resourced appropriately, the coordination is difficult, as we all know. There's unrealistic expectations being set and then, living up to those. We've got not enough, talented leaders to go round. So, I don't think the answer is to point fingers one way or the other, but I do think that it is true that even at the tops of agencies, we need more leadership on this issue. And I think the leadership actually comes from people kind of seeing the light and by seeing that this isn't just okay, it can be challenging, but it's also a fantastic opportunity to improve program quality, to make, to actually make a difference, which is why we're all here after all. And I think the more we can highlight successful examples of where, successful examples usually aren't rocket science, it's usually fairly straightforward, of where, as I mentioned, there are notice boards up and it's really clear what people can expect to receive and why and how people are selected. Using simple pictures and diagrams, maybe hand out leaflets. Mobile phones now make it very possible to have 1-800 numbers, to have coordination between agencies, so that if you're an affected population, you don't want to be calling one number about your water and another number about your food and another number about your non-food items. There needs to be some sort of central mechanism. Now, there are some great examples of where that's working in practice, and I think top leadership kind of need to see and feel good about and feel some ownership of some of those examples. And then they kind of see the light and become, almost, something that they would want to then promulgate and to talk around and to see much more of and to see it as the norm rather than as the exception. So yes, top leadership does need to do more, but we also need the great examples and hopefully more standard operating practices at the field level to be able to point to.
Well, Jasmine, really thank you very much, and your leadership on this is really crucial, both in terms of within the principles and of course towards the greater humanitarian community. The role of the NGOs has been really fantastic on applying AAP, and often we see the NGOs often ask us what's new. We have been doing this for some time. A number of UN agencies are now applied more and more. So indeed, this is not about pointing fingers, but about seeing as a community how to move forward. I'm aware you have another engagement, and really we don't want to keep you any longer on this. So I just want to say a big thank you for making the time and joining us in this webinar on accountability to affected people. Thanks a lot, Jasmine. I'd like now to move to our second speaker, and we have with us Toby Lanzer, who is joining us live from Juba, South Sudan. South Sudan is one of the operations that has been handpicked in order really to share with us how the Humanitarian Coordinator, the Humanitarian Country Team went about applying the accountability to affected people at a practical level, at the field level. So, Toby, welcome to this discussion, and it would be really wonderful if you could share with us your experience from South Sudan about how you went on from a practical point of view on putting to life the accountability to affected people in such a large and complex operation, an L3 with really a large number of actors and locations taking place. So, Toby, over to you.
Panos, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody who is in an afternoon time zone. Good morning or good evening to others. This is a really nice opportunity for me, Panos, and I'd like to thank you for having put this together, because I think, to be honest, all of us are learning every day, and all of us, even in those of us who have been doing this for some time now, aren't as good at what we do as we would like to be. We don't have all of the tools or all of the mechanisms that we feel we could have or we should have, and so this is really a great opportunity for us to listen and to be part of a learning experience. And I'm joined here by Vincent Lele, the head of OCHA, who's sitting here with me. And I think that together with the OCHA team, on the one hand, South Sudan has been in almost a permanent state of crisis for so long, as one of the world's poorest of the poorest countries, as one of the world's countries that became independent without an infrastructure, without institutions of the state, with a largely pastoralist community, much of which is on the move during the year. And of course, this has been compounded by the terrible violence that we've seen over the past 15 months, and now further compounded by being on the verge of economic collapse. And so, to a large extent, during those past 15 months, Panos, I have to be quite clear that, I felt more like a fireman than a humanitarian coordinator. And sometimes we were literally doing the best to help people weather the storm, and it was almost as though we couldn't come up for air ourselves to give due consideration to AAP or to gender issues or the mainstreaming of human rights or whatever else is so important to enhancing the quality of humanitarian response. I think one of the things that we've struggled with here is something that Jasmine just referred to, which is within her own institution, perhaps a lack of understanding, a lack of awareness, and then she referred to humanitarian coordinators, or some of them, who were sort of questioning the utility of this. And I'm pleased not to be in that camp. I think that in some regards, AAP is, if we were in the private sector, then this would be customer relations and it would be customer care. And we would be driven to do it because our survival would depend on it. And I think somehow AAP really could benefit from some sort of industry standard and operating procedures to help humanitarian coordinators institutionalize it across the board. But that said, let me give a couple of examples of what we've done here. I think in terms of my own leadership, I really sense that in meetings that I have with donors, with UN agencies, with NGOs, I ask, what are you doing to listen to people? The people who have been affected by the crisis, the people for whom we are here, whether we're protecting or assisting them. And I'm signaling constantly that this is all about people. And I sometimes worry that we are, you know, it's ironic having just asked you for examples of industry standards or operating procedures. I do sometimes worry that we are consumed by processes and mechanisms, so there is a slight contradiction in what I'm saying to you. But the bottom line is, you know, we spend a lot of time in the humanitarian country team cutting through the processes and the mechanisms and the formalities which have been put in place over the last few years in a very deliberate effort to professionalize our line of work. But we try to cut through those and get back to the real nub of or the essence of the issue, and that is people, you know, women, children, listening. What is it that they need? How is it that we can serve those needs better? And a practical example is that over the past few months in these protection of civilian sites, the organizations that were involved in the provision of shelter, you know, were doing surveys and listening to women's groups and others, and understood that actually the way in which we addressed the shelter issue, it wasn't particularly ideal in this cultural setting, and that actually in some cases we were perhaps exacerbating difficulties or tensions within or between families and sometimes communities. And so we've done a redesign of some of the shelter layout in the POC sites in accordance to what we've heard. We've also heard a lot of comments and we've had a lot of feedback and complaints, if you will, about the way in which food assistance has been provided, distributed, the quantities, the quality, the type of the food assistance, including now with vouchers. Why is it that initially vouchers are just for rice and sorghum? Could vouchers not be exchanged for other products which are available in local markets? And these are adjustments, comments that we've listened to and which have led to very concrete adjustments in our humanitarian program. I think that on participation, here, you know, sometimes we do impose ourselves, don't we, in the sense that, you know, the fact of the matter is men do have a very privileged role in the setting where I'm currently working, and to insist on having a group of women to whom we can listen and whose advice and views we can take seriously and then act on those, it has to be handled in a particular manner so that we don't exacerbate tensions between men and women. And it has been difficult at times to really have men in different sites understand that women need to be part of the conversation. Women have views which we believe are absolutely central to the work that we do, and those are things that we have had to manage quite delicately at times. I think I should probably hand back over to you, Panos, with those opening comments. Perhaps, one comment. Sorry, let me just finish with one thought. I do believe that when we are dealing with our constituents, with the people whom we are here to work with and for, it's absolutely vital that we ask open-ended questions. I still shudder as I go across the country and in my previous positions in other countries when I hear so many of our colleagues, whether they work for UN agencies or donor governments or they're government officials or members of other authorities or indeed working for an NGO, the extent to which people are asking closed questions to children or women or affected populations. And so I think a signal there, which is slow down, take more time, but allow people to shape the conversation, allow the affected populations not to be prompted about their needs, but to explain them in their own words. And I think that will direct us in a better way, in a clearer way, eventually to using the scarce resources we have. And Jasmine referred to those, using our scarce resources in a more effective manner. Thank you.
Toby, thanks a lot. I think your leadership, in particular as Humanitarian Coordinator on this, is really extremely important. And I can see, you're taking a position and interest, and you personally asking the open-ended questions, how vital this is on bringing this qualitative improvement into the response itself. I heard you talking about two things, which I want to repeat because they're really vital. One is about this active listening. You said we're doing a lot of listening to the people, asking the open-ended questions, being open to their comments. And this, I think, is the first step that we all constantly need to do. But that first step, it will not be enough. And you talked about the second step. And the second step is about what you described as the concrete adjustments to the humanitarian program. I heard you talking about whether it was the shelter issue or the feedback on the complaints you got on rice or sorghum or other items. And it's really this, our ability as a humanitarian community to ask the questions, but also to take action based on the feedback and to ensure that this gap sometimes we feel, because we hear the issues, but we sometimes come with our own ideas or inability, because the system is heavy, to be able to adjust and move forward. Toby, I have some more questions for you, very specific on South Sudan. So I'd like to ask for your patience to hold on. I'm going to move to the next speaker, and we'll come back to you as soon as we can. So I'd like to move now to Prita. And Prita, we've heard Toby talking about some examples, specific examples of how the response can be accountable to people, like we saw in the crisis in South Sudan. So I want to ask you, when we look at the accountability of affected people, when we talk about taking account, giving account, and being held to account, how practically, what does it actually mean from an operational point of view? How do we bring these three simple, very important words to life when it comes to operations? Prita, over to you.
Thank you, Panos. Yes, let me try to explain in broad strokes what taking, giving, and being held to account, as you've just framed it, might look like. But I will begin by setting out a little bit why, so the normative framework, but also with a view very much to grounding that in terms of how do we then operationalize it using these three components that you've just mentioned. And I'd go back to how you opened, and Jasmine spoke to this too, that is the responsible use of power combined with more effective and quality programming, together constituting the essentials of accountability to the communities we work with. However, humanitarian action that realizes these accountability commitments that we've signed up to requires that we make some key connections with the work on accountability, and that is between accountability, placing human rights at the forefront of our work, and the centrality of protection. This integration of what are really mutually reinforcing core principles of humanitarian action help us better support states fulfill their protection and accountability obligations, and help us become much more effective as humanitarian actors in bringing stability and normalcy to the lives of men, women, girls, and boys who are caught up in conflicts or other types of crises. In the humanitarian program cycle, we have at our disposal the components of a system that can advance accountability, operationalize it. And here I speak about the needs assessment and analysis that we do as part of our methodology, strategic response planning, program design and implementation, and operational monitoring and evaluation. But do we use them well to serve accountability goals and to operationalize what we've set out in the normative framework? So to go back to the three components, taking account really means giving affected people influence over decision-making in a way that is inclusive, non-discriminatory, and accounts for the diversity of communities. I recall what Toby was just referring to about the difficulties that this can sometimes, that we can sometimes be faced with to try to do this in communities where the power differentials within the communities are challenging. But we know that displacement, other kinds of crises do create an environment where we can exert positive influence on communities. We can reduce harmful practices. We can empower marginalized groups. We can encourage pluralism and equality. This is as much part of our agenda as it is to look at the assistance side of what we do. So I would go back again and emphasize that the taking account does include age, gender, and diversity considerations when designing our interventions based on those needs assessments that we conduct as a matter of course now. Listening or collecting feedback alone, as you just mentioned, isn't enough. We often think of that as the participation piece of our framework. Individual organizations, humanitarian actors at the collective level need to incorporate their feedback into their strategies and programs. We need to be able to adapt our program content, our prioritization of what we're going to do to that based on the feedback we get. Many individual organizations are now putting in place individual feedback mechanisms, but at the collective level is where we can have the greatest impact. We can have impact by reinforcing transparency, by creating peer pressure, and this needs to, so collective feedback mechanisms can really bring that about in a much more effective manner. Giving account is really about the sharing of information with communities in an effective and transparent manner. It's about information on our roles and responsibilities in a humanitarian setting, about what communities that we're working with are entitled to, and the targeting criteria we're using to determine those entitlements, as well as the reasons why these criteria and entitlements change during the program cycle. It's about letting people know how to provide feedback or how to raise complaints. And information needs critically to be shared in a way that communities can actually understand it, that they can be empowered by it and become very active participants in the response, or even change agents within their own communities. Jasmine spoke earlier on about the different ways in which this information can be disseminated. And this morning we had people asking us, you know, how do you work on information dissemination with communities that may not be literate? Well, and I think Toby spoke to this earlier, that direct communication, that immediate face-to-face engagement with people of concern is really not replaceable. All these other mechanisms are only part of what we bring to that, but the face-to-face is critical. Being held to account means giving others the opportunity to assess and, if appropriate, sanction your actions. Affected populations are rarely in a position where they have the agency or power to select the organizations that support them during a crisis, nor the type of support they will get, at least initially. And their view on the quality of the service or response is not sought frequently enough. Being accountable involves actually asking communities what they think about the quality of the response. At the individual agency level, we do that, but are we doing it sufficiently? Is that being brought up at the collective level? Affected populations should be involved in monitoring programs, and their point of view on the success and impact of a humanitarian intervention should be central to any evaluations. We all are now doing real-time evaluations, both at the individual agency level and at the collective level. And I know we speak to people in the communities that we're working with. We do that as a matter of course during evaluations, but you don't see that coming through in the reporting enough, so that people's programs from the outset are then informed by that. Sexual exploitation and abuse of affected community members by anyone associated with the provision of aid constitutes probably one of the most serious breaches of accountability. And affected populations should be able to raise complaints and call for appropriate protection measures against such abuse. So taking account, giving account, and being held to account is necessary, both at the level of individual agencies, but is also crucial at the collective level. And I would say this is perhaps where we need to focus some of our attention. This obligation to be accountable applies not only in emergencies, of course, but also throughout the humanitarian response, and critically, the transition and development phases of engagement with communities. So I would leave it there until we open up for more questions and answers. Thank you.
Rita, wow, thanks a lot. It's really important to understand the policy, to understand the principle, and then to see, of course, how to take it down and apply it. I almost feel like I need to have next to my desk these three words: taking account, giving account, and being held to account every day to remind all of us on the importance of putting this in place. As you were speaking, we also got a number of questions coming, Prita, to you. So likewise, I'm going to ask you to be patient. I'd like to, and I'll come back to you with the more specific questions. I'd like actually now to move to the second case study. We've heard earlier on from Toby in South Sudan. I'd like us now to move to the Philippines example. And actually we have Sutapa, who is joining this call from her break in Australia to share her experience on the Philippines. And actually, Sutapa, I'd like to ask you, Prita talked about the individual accountability mechanism, and we talked earlier on about the lack of collective accountability mechanism, lack of accountability mechanism towards the affected people from us as humanitarian actors, UN and NGO working together. You worked last year for a number of months in the Philippines after the Typhoon Haiyan in an L3 operation, and you brought to life this accountability to affected people on a collective point of view. So can you just explain a little bit what is the difference between an individual, a collective, and if you could say a few words about the Philippines experience in a natural disaster and how you put in place a mechanism to ensure this proactive listening, the taking action is taking place in a respectful way for the communities we're trying to help. Sutapa, over to you.
Thanks, panelists. Lovely to be with you all, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone else. I'm assuming no one else is from my end of the world. It's getting close to 1 a.m., so I apologize if I'm not as articulate as I am earlier in the day. Working in the Philippines during the Yolanda response was probably an exceptional time because of exactly what Prita was discussing earlier. Normally there's a real lack of that individual, well, there's definitely efforts by a lot of agencies to have accountability at that individual agency level, but having accountability come together at that collective level can often be difficult. And I think that part of the reason why we did manage to achieve this in the Philippines was coming back to that leadership and governance aspect of accountability. And that is, we had strong support from OCHA, strong support from a number of great agencies, including UNHCR, UNICEF, ActionAid, World Vision, International Plan, and the list goes on, who were all very, very committed to AAP at a collective level. So for one very simple example of individual accountability on an agency level would be if one of those individual agencies had a feedback from the community that was in relation to something to do with their staffing quality, and a community member perhaps being unhappy with the way one of their staff were behaving. And that's something they might deal with on an individual level. But as Preetha was discussing, the influence that you can have and the advocacy that you can have on a collective basis is far greater and far more important. And that's why the consolidated community feedback mechanisms that we put in place in the Philippines were so important. One example of an impact of a collective accountability impact that we had as a result of the feedback mechanisms we had in place was that one of the pieces that came through at the hub level, both in Tacloban and then in Rojas, through our AAP working groups, was that no build zones was a real issue, and in particular, in certain areas where they were being put up, it really prevented people from rebuilding homes in a place where they could be close enough to the town to trade, and in a place where it was actually accessible for them to be able to get on and rebuild. That ended up, and I'll describe a little bit about the mechanism in a minute, but that ended up resulting in going all the way through to the Humanitarian Country team, where they wrote a letter of advice to the Philippines government, and collectively with the government they reviewed that policy, and it resulted in a national policy change to some of those no-build zones. So that's just an example of some of the impacts that collective accountability mechanisms can have. And the way that we did this in the Philippines is just like to go through like the steps and have a kind of illustrative example of it. Is again, we have those individual agencies that were collecting community feedback. And then in the hubs in Tacloban, in Rojas, and in Cebu, and then later on, I actually ended up working in Mindanao as well, in Zamboanga and Cotabato. We had AAP working groups collecting information in combination with the CWC teams from individual agencies. And then through those AAP working groups, we had come up with a community feedback form. And just an important thing to note here is that each district was quite different. And again, the way that you collect feedback and the way that you analyze feedback in those districts, you have to make sure that it's actually fit for purpose. For example, Tacloban and the way it was impacted by Yolanda was quite different to the way Rojas was. So again, when consolidating that feedback from the individual agency feedback and looking at across it as districts, you have to take those things into consideration. So that was sort of step 2. And then moving on to step 3, we would then consolidate that feedback and analyze it, the key themes that would emerge that was beyond that individual agency feedback and at that collective agency or collective cluster level. For example, apart from the no-build zone example I gave previously, another key issue that was coming through for the Philippines was beneficiary selection, particularly in relation to shelter. So that was one that wasn't restricted to one agency in particular, but was across agencies. And communities were saying they were not clear about how people were being selected. And this caused a lot of anxiety and a lot of unknown for communities going forward. So again, looking at themes like that and other themes around health and protection that emerged, we would then theme those feedbacks into a one-pager that we had, and then that would be shared at the hub level for hub-level information at the intercluster coordination meetings. And again, this is where leadership and governance come into play, because we had the intercluster coordinators at each of the hubs committed to having AAP as a standing agenda item at those meetings. And then also, again, depending on how responsive the clusters were, and Shelter Cluster were actually extremely responsive and very positive about AAP feedback, because they saw that as lending evidence to often things that they were seeing as issues within their cluster as well. And they would often use that information to campaign at HCT level. So again, combining all of those hub information and then bringing it to the Manila level for things that actually went across the entire response that wasn't hub specific would be part of my role as AAP advisor, and I would bring that to intercluster coordination meetings in Manila. And then also, when relevant, like with that no build zone issue, it would be raised at the humanitarian country team meetings on the relevant issues, and that was step 5. And most importantly, which isn't one of those 5 steps, but really should be maybe a 6th step, or just an underlying definite goal of everything, is that closing the loop and making sure that whatever action was taken or not taken is actually brought back to the community and is communicated to a community. And one key way with the shelter example that we did that was work through the AAP and CWC working groups to have messaging around how beneficiary selection was done by different agencies for shelter, and to try and actually have some sort of consistency with the way that beneficiaries were selected across the shelter cluster in that way. So I hope that provides a little bit of an illustrative example of how we did that in the Philippines. Back to you, panel.
Sutapa, really thank you so much, and it does make sense, despite being 2 a.m. in your time in Australia. I think the 5 points you have are very clear. You also spoke about point 6 or even point 7 possibly, which is really the taking action based on the feedback, and then whatever action is taken or not taken, to go back and provide that to the community. I think these steps, I hope, are very useful, and I can see actually from our chat box, we have colleagues who are listening to this conversation from Colombia to Afghanistan, from Liberia, Kenya, a number of places in Africa. It is these practical steps that colleagues are looking to see how they can really put in action the accountability to affected people in their own operation. I'm keen to move actually to our 3rd case study, to our 3rd example, and I'd like to bring in this conversation Nicola Seri. Nicola is joining this conversation from Nairobi, Kenya. Actually, the last 2 case studies were both in L3 operations. We've heard about South Sudan, we've heard about the Philippines. We chose Kenya because accountability to affected people is really applicable to all situations, not just on the L3. It's also applicable whether we're talking about a humanitarian or a development context, because it's the same principle that drives all of us. So, Nicholas, I'd like to ask you if you could really explain the mechanism that you have put in place in Kenya on a drought-affected program involving over 45 partners. And what is also very important is that involves also the government, the local NGOs, the United Nations agencies, really the broader community in terms of taking these lessons and seeing how to apply, to adjust, to reprogram, to take action, to inform the communities in the best possible way. Nicola, over to you. We're really keen to hear your experience from Kenya.
Thank you very much, panel. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Sutapa has mentioned some of the comparative advantage of the collective approach to accountability to affected population in terms of joint advocacy and learning. I want also to bring it from the people perspective. When we conducted an analysis of the drought response in Kenya in 2011, asking people about their satisfaction and their ability to provide their views and complaints and feedback to agencies. One of the main thing they were telling us was that many times they don't know who is doing what. They don't know who's providing the food or the health services or the NFIs, and therefore, even if agencies have their own complaint and feedback mechanisms, if they don't know who is providing the service, they don't know where to get back to. So there were multiple numbers of reporting mechanisms that were actually confusing people. And I think Yasmin mentioned that earlier, like you don't want to call a different number when it's about your food or your NFI or the quality of the health services. So taking that into account, we've developed in discussion with state agencies here in Kenya, a number of international organizations and local organizations, a single one-stop complaint and feedback mechanisms that is integrated at county level, and that we're implementing for the last year with over 45 organizations, where basically people can provide their feedback or complaints regarding all sector, all service provider, even if they don't know who's providing that particular services, and to one single SMS number. They can also provide their feedback through the web-based platforms, through internet directly, or speaking to any frontline staff from all our partner organizations. So we've agreed on a joint complaint and feedback forum, on joint messages, and basically people can also use the direct interaction with staff to provide their feedback. I will go back a bit after on how that works exactly. But in terms of the comparative advantage, it also brings a coordinated response. Many times, one single organization cannot respond to that particular complaint from the community. And I can give you an example of how it has been effective in the Kenyan context. There is a big cash transfer program that is the Hunger Safety Net program, which is supported by the government and the National Drought Management Authority, where people can receive 50 euro equivalent every 2 months as a cash entitlement. And when the targeting was done earlier last year, many people didn't know if they were on the list. Many others were not able to receive their cash because their name had an error, or their ID card number was wrong or missing. And we received several complaints from communities on that. And that basically brought together the National Drought Management Authority to work closely with HelpAge International, who's responsible for that particular program, together with a local organization that led to basically those lists to be provided at community level, names rectified, ID numbers missing provided, and as a direct result, 4,000 households were able to open a bank account and are now receiving 50 euro every 2 months. So that's just a simple example on how agencies can also work together in addressing people's complaints. So how does it work basically? I've mentioned that people can report it through internet, phones, or direct interaction with staff. Now, the basic MOU we've signed with our 45 partners is that they are committing to take people's feedback on behalf of other service providers in the county. So basically, they're not just listening to people when it's relating to their own operation, but they're listening to people in general when they have a feedback about aid or service provision at the county level. And if that specific feedback is not for their own organization, they will have a specific credential and login, and they can upload the feedback into the system, and it's being referred automatically to the organization that is concerned. The outreach is also done jointly by all our partners within their own operations. So we've agreed on common messages. We have designed joint communication materials that all of our partners are using. So we are speaking with one voice to the communities. We're also using other means like Radio FM. Every month we have with our partners 1 hour of interactive show where people can call in directly and ask questions to agencies or state organizations that are providing aid and services at the county level. We've recently upgraded our web-based platform so that we can also use the database of phone numbers of community who have interacted with the system to broadcast early warning information through SMS via the web-based platform, and it's a service that is available to all our partners when they have a relevant early warning information to share with people. Maybe the last point. The system also provides direct time report about the data that are coming from the system, so we can see in real time what type of sectors are affected by the feedback or complaints. So we can have breakdown per sector, per type of complaint, per age group, per gender, per sublocation, and that's also like very useful information for agencies and government providing aid and services in the county in terms of what are the issues from the community point of view. I will maybe stop here and be happy to take more questions.
Nicola, it's really music on our ear to hear the practical steps, the various methods that you have put in place in order to hear, to ask, to take the feedback and to readjust the plan. You talked about the SMS, you talked about the written form, the various methods. You really bring it within a program with 45 organizations, including the government, and to do what really we hope one day, as soon as possible, to have in place in every single operation around the world, to be able to do this accountability in the most responsible way. I have a number of questions, so I'd like actually to move back into Juba, and I'd like to ask Toby a question that we got from one of our colleagues listening, and actually the question has two components, and I'll ask them both. So the question is, in a country where it is so difficult to have access to affected people because of the insecurity and the issues taking place, what are the creative ways that you have found in order to implement the accountability to affected people? So it's really about access and AEP, this discussion with the community. And the second part of the question is, the caller is asking, are there no dangers that in particular local NGOs and community service organizations are facing while implementing the accountability to affected people for international NGOs or for the broader communities? Is there a danger that they could be using power politics that could exacerbate the problem and the situation on the ground? Toby, over to you.
Thank you very much, Panos, and thanks to the participant who provided those two pretty tricky questions. I think, you know, listening to Nicola just now, I was thinking, wow, it would be fabulous to have a situation in South Sudan where there's a telephone network, or it would be fabulous if we could use SMS. It would be remarkable if we had a mechanism to reach and survey in some more consistent manners the views of the 2 million people who have been displaced, whether they're still inside South Sudan or further afield. So I think there's an element of jealousy as well when I was listening to our colleague who I hope isn't still awake in the middle of the night in Australia, but if she is, hats off, and hats off for a fantastic job in the Philippines and for giving me some really straightforward and practical advice, which we've taken on board. So, you know, in terms of reaching out to people, I think what I've tried to do here is use the Common Humanitarian Fund, which is a very substantial fund. Last year we allocated, I can't remember precisely, but it would have been about 150 million US dollars for projects implemented by a variety of organizations, about 60 different organizations across the country. And what I really demanded via the Common Humanitarian Fund was that when it came to the moment of assessment, project design, implementation and the like, there were very specific questions that had to be asked of the affected populations, and the answers had to be taken on board. I don't know how innovative that was, but it was one of the things that I had at my disposal as a humanitarian coordinator. And bearing in mind that a humanitarian coordinator cannot instruct, cannot demand that an institution such as an NGO or a UN agency does A, B, or C. We have powers of persuasion, and in the case of the Common Humanitarian Fund, well, there we can use enticements to really call on institutions to listen to people, to design projects, to modify them as the situation evolves in accordance with what people are providing in terms of feedback, complaints, if you will, and the like. Now, much of the Common Humanitarian Fund was used to finance projects of national NGOs. In fact, when you look at the entire amount of money that went for national NGOs here in 2014, well over half of all of the money that national NGOs got came from the Common Humanitarian Fund. And so, yes, there were risks involved. Of course there were. And yes, there are risks of local politics and different views being applied. We've had a tremendously challenging environment here in South Sudan because of the tension between certain communities and what people refer to as the ethnic dimension to the conflict, meaning that certain national staff or certain national NGOs could work in some parts of the country but not in others. So of course there have been political dynamics and risks that could exacerbate tensions on the ground. However, I think we've, via the cluster system, been very careful with who goes where and who does what. But ultimately, it's also, I mean, it's the aid workers themselves who have been forced by the situation to not put themselves in harm's way, and harm's way here has been a set of very acute situations that have had a direct impact on the welfare of national staff and national NGOs at certain times. So yes, the issue of power politics is there, but I'm not sure that it's there anymore in this setting than it would be in similar settings. But you know, we've done what we can to mitigate against it. So Panos, that's what I can offer on this one. Perhaps a final thought, of course, was the fact that we have hired a series of United Nations volunteers who have come in and been part of the cluster system, in particular to monitor not only the situation of need, but really the results and the impact of the project by the Common Humanitarian Fund. And I think, again, that's been their site visits, their interaction with the NGOs, has been very helpful for us to be able to really understand the extent to which AAP is part and parcel of the everyday work of the NGOs or UN agencies that we've been supporting financially. That said, I think we could have done more. I think there's much more that can be done. And I think that, as Jasmine admitted very honestly, and I can do the same, the extent to which AAP has really taken hold, the extent to which there is practice which is replicated on a wide scale, or that there are mechanisms in place, or industry standards, if you will, is still very, very limited. And I think we need to recognize that and rectify it over the coming months and years. Over to you.
Toby, thanks. I think indeed there is a lot more to be done in the putting in place the accountability to affected people, and I do hope that this small little step, the webinar, helps us to really put it a lot more further and sharing within a community of best practices to bring it to life in the best possible way. Many organizations and operations do ask for help, and actually I would like to move to Prita and ask a question we got from actually several callers who are saying it's interesting to hear these models. Our situation, there are some similarities, but actually it's not the same. If we need help in terms of tailor-making the response and the approach to our own context, where do we go? Is there somebody we can interact with? Prita, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Panos. Yes, there is, and we'd like to we're using this opportunity of the webinar to launch a help desk that the IASC task team on PSEA and AAP is just beginning to get off the ground, and that help desk can support operations, contextualize how best to apply and put in place the framework that we've talked about earlier in this webinar. And there are two ways that we can do that. We would do that both through a sort of Q&A that you can look at and use and submit questions to, but also where we'd be able to direct you to experts on the specific issues that you're grappling with. Maybe they're communication and information sharing issues, or more broadly on the programmatic side, how to adapt a program and how to link the participatory processes that you are working on to that program content. So the help desk is there. I think it's up on the screens if you're looking at the screen, but I can also just give you the email address. It's helpdesk-AAP-PSEA@unhcr.org. And we have a group of organizations who are members of the ISC task team who are going to help us respond to the requests that we receive from field operations.
Thanks, Prita. It's good to know there is a help desk that is in place, and I guess this is as part of the task force co-chairing that there is an area, there's a particular person that could go for help. I'd like actually to move to the next question, and I'm moving to Sutapa. We have a question from Jerusalem, from the OPT, and the question is, how do you avoid creating false expectations by involving communities, asking them to identify the options they prefer, and then really not having the resources to be able to deliver? Sutapa, over to you.
Thanks, and that's a very important and interesting question. I was actually in Palestine and worked in Hebron with ActionAid for about a year and a half there. So the way to do it is to be as honest as possible. And let me use perhaps an example from the Philippines during our after action review for that. During the after action review, a group of, I think I've actually got a video of someone up on, right, it's gone. During the After Action Review in the Philippines, we had a consolidated group of people going out to do community consultations to find out how best to look at early recovery and also future disaster risk reduction in terms of future typhoon response for the Philippines. During that period, we collated all of the information we got from the community, and then we used it during our after action review with the government to look at our preparedness plans for the future. Now, after all of that, one of the most important things to do, again, as I mentioned previously, was to go back to those communities and speak to them about how we use the information and whether or not action was actually taken with their inputs around what needed to be adapted to in terms of early warning signals and various other things. And one of the agency aid workers who was going back out to these communities to give feedback of what was done with the actions actually turned around and said to me, Sutapa, I'm not actually that confident about going back. I don't know that we have done enough with the community feedback, or if we've had enough input and created enough change with what they gave us during one particular thing in this after action review. And I said, well, it's time for us to be accountable for that. If we didn't influence change enough, if we didn't use that information well enough, let's have a deep think as to why we didn't and how we could in the future, or what challenges we had. And part of going back to the communities and letting them know whether action was achieved and not, and how and why, is a part of having that very open, honest, transparent discussion with them. So we still went back, and when action was taken, it was positive. Obviously, good news is very easy to give, but actually being realistic about what we can do with the information and how we can influence is also incredibly important. So I hope that sort of answers that. And again, yes, in Palestine, it was incredibly difficult, but I think also in that context, all of the communities that I worked with, which was mostly in Area C, had a very, very strong understanding of how complex and how difficult the situation is there, and have very realistic expectations of what can be achieved.
Sutapa, thanks. I guess keeping this honest dialogue and really being able to tell good news and bad news, being able to engage the community in a respectful way is really the bottom line, to be able to be transparent and say whatever the news are, to give them back to them. I'd like actually to move to Prita, and we have a couple of callers who have sent the same question, which is really about the linkages between the accountability to affected people and the centrality of protection. Another caller is saying, how does the protection cluster really interact and with the accountability of affected people? So Prita, can you elaborate a little bit on this AAP and protection cluster? Over to you.
Thank you, Panos. Perhaps I'd begin to do that with a very concrete example or experience, if you like. In the last operation that I was in just a couple of years ago, we had a situation where there was fairly large-scale displacement from very remote locations into less remote locations from our perspective, but from theirs, pretty sophisticated environments where, you had government institutions in place, government agencies doing their normal administration and providing the normal services that they would be required to. The response from the humanitarian organizations tended to be the usual, very material assistance focused, packages of non-food items, organizing food supplies, etc. When in fact, what we learned very quickly, actually, from the community, because they were not shy, was that, well, actually, the communities that were being hosted in are supporting many of those types of needs, including setting up, communal kitchens, etc., giving us shelter. What we would really like the focus to be on is to help us get the very necessary documentation that our families have never had, because we've always been sort of out there in locations where we've not had that administration outreach too. And here's an opportunity for us to be counted, if you like, to become visible, to get the documentation we need. And that was really what they were focused on, and we had sort of lost the plot on that. We had not thought that through, and I think that to some extent illustrates very well the very important linkages between being accountable and protection. They are mutually reinforcing, and effective protection delivery requires us to meet our accountability commitments, several of which outline ways in which protection can be realized. So for protection to inform humanitarian action, we need to be able to identify who is most at risk and why. What are their most pressing needs? What is on their minds in terms of what's going to help them and their children and their community as a whole for the next several years even. They may have their very immediate needs met, but sometimes our default positions come into play, and it's then a little bit difficult to turn what can sometimes be a rather unwieldy system around. But if we look at accountability and protection as two pieces that need to work together, we can really develop the kinds of comprehensive and community-based approaches to intervention and advocacy with government partners, with civil society organizations, and that complementarity of roles can really make us much more effective. The recently released protection mainstreaming training package actually highlights accountability as one of the 4 pillars of protection mainstreaming. So if, it's fairly new, but I think it's being disseminated quite effectively. So if colleagues who would like to get a little more practical guidance on that can look at that online or a copy of it, I think that will also help to give you a little more information on those very critical linkages between the two. Thank you.
Thanks, Britta. And indeed, the rights up front approach really makes us put the communities in the center and having this human rights thinking in the response in all aspects of no matter what we do is absolutely crucial. I'd like to move back to Juba and ask Toby a question that we got from the UK, from a caller, who is really asking about the donor role, the role of the donors in putting in place, in supporting, in making sure that the accountability to affected people takes place. And the caller is saying, sometimes we're in a difficult situation because on the one hand, the donors are really putting pressure, obviously, about a speedier implementation, while at the same time, we feel that really they don't have much patience for accountability. At the same time, several donors, of course, put the accountability on the top of their agenda in terms of where we really want to go. So, Toby, would you comment on that? What has been your experience and what role could the donors, should the donors play in supporting this? Toby, over to you.
Thank you very much for the question, which I think is really important. I think 2 points to make here. One is, from the very outset, we need to have a consistent, open, and frank exchange with the donor community, both the donors who are represented in embassies locally, as well as with donors who are following events from neighboring countries or indeed from donor capitals. And in that sense, you really can bridge a lot of these issues which arise and get over pressure under which donors are, you know, they have to spend their money by a certain time, but also explaining that, well, whilst other parts of donor governments are calling for AAP, you can't be pressing us into an unreasonable time constraint simultaneously. So I think it's all about communicating consistently, openly, and constructively with the donor community. But I think there's another point here, Panos, which I wanted to make. You know, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're looking at the response in country A or country B, or setting X or setting Y. In almost all cases, you will find that it's no more than 25 organizations. It'll be a handful from the United Nations. It'll be the International Committee of the Red Cross. It'll be Médecins Sans Frontières and about 20 other non-governmental organizations, and it'll be IOM. It'll be those sort of 25 institutions who are providing at least 85% of the goods, of the services, carrying out the work as a response to an emergency. So if we are going to streamline AAP, I would actually say, you know, those are the places where you have to begin. It has to be with an NGO such as World Vision, Save the Children, the heavy hitters, the NGOs who are the biggest in any of the settings. And within the UN, we know which agencies it'll be. It'll be, as Preeta, you know, knows so well, it'll be HCR, and it'll be WFP and UNICEF, and perhaps in some places WHO and FAO, who are part of that heavy hitter top 25 organizational setting, providing about 85% or more of everything that's happening in regards to goods and services, protection and assistance provided to people in need. Now that might surprise people who are listening, but it is actually the case. We know this from so many settings where we've been working. So I think that if we want to make AAP part and parcel of what we do, it's a conversation within those institutions, it's a conversation between them, and it's a conversation with the donor community to really make this gain traction. And I think that the webinar that you've been holding today, this morning and this afternoon, has really helped me gain a much better understanding of this, and I look forward to working with you and others over the coming months and years to really make sure that listening to people, not only talking with them, but listening to them, is really guiding every step of what we do. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Toby, and really thanks for your openness and frankness on discussing about this issue and acknowledging where we are, and also having the vision in terms of where we want to be. And I think by having this openness and honesty is crucial for all of us. I know we're running out of time, but I really want to go to Nicholas in Nairobi, because we have a caller who has sent a question on the importance of accountability to affected people during emergency preparedness, as well as a response. So Nicholas, in 2 words, because we're really running out of time, what do you see should be done, could be done in the preparedness phase, and also in this initial response phase with regards to bringing to life the accountability to affected people? Nicola, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Panos. Yeah, I think what agency can do during the emergency preparedness phase is really key, and will have a big impact on their ability to really be accountable to affected population during the emergency phase, where it's more difficult when you're, especially during the first phase of the response. It's difficult to really start thinking about setting up such systems. So I think, like, first it's internally, you know, during the emergency preparedness, like set up internal system on how your agency wants to engage with people. How do you share information with people? How do you address the complaint, how you will be providing feedback in a specific context, so also engaging people on what ways of communication works in certain contexts. I mean, in Kenya we can use mobile phone. In South Sudan it might be more difficult. So you need also to look at your context and also build the capacities of your staff at all levels. And I think the leadership signals for that are quite key. And you cannot build the capacity of your staff when they are busy responding. You can only do it during the emergency preparedness phase.
Thanks, Nicolas. I can see we've run out of time, so I'd like to first of all remind everybody that I hope you have responded to the polling that we have put on screen a few minutes ago, where we really would value receiving your feedback in terms of this webinar, what has worked, what was useful from what you heard from our speakers. We will continue with this series of webinars on the transformative agenda, and one of the forthcoming one is actually going to be also on the PSEA, which we didn't really touch base much in this afternoon's webinar about sexual exploitation and how this feeds within the accountability to affected people protocol and practice in place. I'd like to remind everybody that this webinar is recorded, and it will be available online. If any of the colleagues who were not able to join, they would be able to replay it. I also want to let you know that we will be coming back to you who have attended today in a month's time or so to hear a little bit how what you heard today you were able to translate it into action, hopefully in your own operation. So in conclusion, first of all, I would like really to thank our speakers. It was wonderful to have Jasmine, to have Toby, Nicolas, Tutapa, and Prita sharing their reflections and best practices on the accountability to affected people, looking at the policy, but also looking at the 3 case studies where we talked about South Sudan, about Kenya, and about the Philippines. And of course, I'd like to thank all of you who have participated in this webinar and heard it and asked our questions and participated with us. You see in front of you on the screen the background documents that are all available to download and to link. We hope you will access them. There is also practical information there that hopefully will help you put in life, bring to life, put in action the AAP within your own context. So really a big thank you to all of you, and from me and the team, I would like to wish you all the best and a good continuation with your work wherever you are and wherever you have joined us from this webinar. So from all of us here in Geneva, goodbye and thank you.